You can learn from my mistakes. People always want to learn. People always want to save money. Sometimes when you're running a business, you agree to things and then you wish you'd not. You've also got to keep pushing yourself. It's that fine balance of staying in your comfort zone but also pushing yourself to try and learn new stuff. I don't care who you are, not everything goes to plan. I've messed up loads of cars. That's how you know what to do and what not to do. You know, YouTube didn't even exist. There was no content out there before. If you want to do something different, you're going to have to do it off your own back on a real car. Thing is, that's when stuff gets real, innit? If you mess up someone's car, you know, it could cost you a lot of time and money. It'd be nice if someone else could make the mistakes and then you just copy what they do. It's when you're doing something and you've never seen it done before, that's the thing. If I bodged this guy's car, I was got to go to a body shop. That'd be embarrassing. These were probably the worst headlights I'd ever seen. I couldn't work out if they were chipped on the inside and or the outside. For some reason I agreed to have a go at them. I don't know if it was the right decision or not. You never do. The problem is you won't know until you get to the end of them, really. If I mess them up, it's going to cost me a lot. And the other thing is, if they don't look good when I've done them, I've completely wasted my time. I've done loads of headlights, but not like this. Shouldn't have agreed to do his bonnet. Imagine if you could just watch somebody that's done it 1,000 times and then just replicate it. Welcome guys, this isn't a long video but it's definitely action packed, plenty of value, plenty of good content, so let's get on with it. Okay, so the car that I'm working on is a really nice BMW 3 Series of a client of mine. He was really into his cars, he cleaned it every week, he looked after it mechanically, pride and joy, but I think he likes to drive it, which is fair enough, and it's accumulated quite a bit of front end damage. Standard stuff really, you know, these high performance modern cars. I don't know what the roads are like all over the world, but in England they're absolutely terrible. So loads of potholes, loads of loose grit, you know, on the surface, flicking up, flicks all up your bumper, flicks all up your bonnet. It's just an ongoing battle really. So I'm just getting this front bumper scotched up first, and while I was doing that I actually noticed that the customer had applied loads of like bumper gel onto the plastic areas. We need to be removing all that stuff, particularly if we decide to spray any areas around the front end. I noticed at this point as well that the bumper had been painted before, so it was peeling underneath the headlight. Quite a common thing where whoever's repaired it hasn't quite keyed up the surface underneath the headlight. A bit of laziness perhaps, probably rushing about. Not a problem really, I just rolled up a little small sanding disc of probably 320 and then followed it up with some 600 wet and dry. Because this is a multi-area job with several things going off, I've got a multitask to try and get it all done, and that includes letting the paint dry. So I scotched up the front end first because I wanted to touch in some chips on the front bumper, as you can see, but I've also scotched it before that I touched them up. So now I'm just going around the bonnet and touching the chips up, but there's absolutely thousands of them. So I know people are always like, what's the best way of doing this, what's the best way of doing that? It depends on each job really. I mean, this had thousands of tiny very shallow chips on it, so I actually decided just to dab them in. I'd never done it this way before, and I've done 1,000 front end chips. It's a bit scary at times. So I was just dabbing them in, and then I was just sort of like, while it was just wet, just that couple of seconds later, just flicking my finger down just to kind of smooth it into the chips. I didn't honestly know at this point if that was a good idea or not. As mentioned, we are multitasking on this job, so while the paint's drying on the bonnet, I've got to have a look at these headlights. Genuinely, I couldn't tell if this weird stone chip hazing, crazy hazing damage was on the outside or the inside. For some reason I just thought, well, let's go for it. and I basically put a 120 disc on my little sanding machine, and I just started proper hitting it hard. One of the problems with this is you can't really see what progress you're making because it goes all cloudy. You can see when you've broke through the UV layer, but other than that you don't know how far you sand in, how thick the plastic is. Sorry guys, I had to add that. That's what you feel like inside when you're working on someone's pride and joy, and you're sort of doing something you don't even know what you're doing. You don't know if it's going to turn out. It's yeah, stressful. So on the headlights I hit them with 120, 180, 320, then 400, and then as you can see in the video here, we're just going over it again, all the whole lot with some 600 wet and dry. So at this point you think, have I messed this up? A lot of these headlamps now, with all the bulbs and all the technology, they're just not cheap. They're not cheap. But at this point now, it's half sanded. You've sort of got your leg in on it now, so you've just got to crack on and hope for the best, really. One of my concerns at this point was, have I sanded too much of the plastic? Has it compromised the plastic thickness or something like that? I wasn't sure. Another problem is, if you've been using such a coarse grit with any kind of sanding, you've got to remove each level of grit with the grit after it, and sometimes if you've not quite removed the first grit, the 120 in this case, and you get all the way through your stages to where we are now, to the polishing stage, it's going to show some marks from the beginning and you're going to have to go through it all again. So I've just used some compound to polish out the fine sanding marks. I'm pretty happy with how it's come out, but we're going to come back to it a bit later on because I wasn't completely happy with it, if I'm honest. So I just flip back over at this point to have a look at these chips, what I touched in and smudged the paint. I just did a little section on the top of the bonnet with some 1500 grit. I just wanted to see what it kind of looked like once it's sanded back. Like I say, this is kind of an experimental stage, so I was kind of learning on the job. I didn't really know how it was going to turn out, so at this point I'm just going through the motions really and trying to figure out the best way forward. Okay, so originally I wasn't actually going to respray this bumper. The customer had not asked me to do that. I was just going to try and touch the chips up and sort the headlights out and then give it a good thorough polish on the front end. I had to point out to the customer, you know, some areas that he'd probably not noticed, like underneath the headlight was flaking because it'd been painted before. There was also a couple of really deep gouges, and I thought, if he wants it to look nice, then we're going to have to probably respray it. So as you can see, I've sanded back the areas that were showing some deeper damage, and then I'm just going to apply some primer to this area. Now this is something you can do without a spray gun. A rattle can primer is just as good as this primer, what I'm using here. It was only a 1K primer that I used to use that comes straight out the gun. Exactly the same, you apply it, a little bit of heat over the top, not too much. We're not trying to overcook it or anything like that. Once it's set, if you're using a rattle can, I'd probably just leave it for 10 minutes, apply a second coat, and then leave it again probably for an hour. At that point, if it's dried under normal temperatures, you can just start knocking it back with some 800 sandpaper. After that, you need to give it a good wipe down and clean up with some panel wipe, and make sure that all your areas are nicely masked off, ready for some base coat. I'm obviously using a spray gun in this instance, but you can do this with a rattle can, it's absolutely no different. Ideally you want to be applying 3 coats separately with about 5 to 10 minutes apart. Then after you've applied the base coat, colour coat, you should at that stage be applying some kind of lacquer. Again, this is something that can be done out of a rattle can. It's exactly the same process, it's no different. In fact, my next set of videos is going to be how to use aerosol cans, rattle cans, to get good finish on your car panels or on your bodywork if you've repaired it. I'd appreciate it if you hit subscribe, and then after you've watched the video, leave a comment below, press the like button, really helps the channel. So at this point now I'm applying a second coat. This one's more of a full coat, so I want a nice wet glossy finish because this is going to be the last coat of lacquer that we're going to apply. Pretty happy with that. Don't forget, we're painting outside, we're not in a booth. So I'm just using this little gadget. It looks fancy. All the customers used to ask me about it. I think it costs about £6. It was just a little temperature gauge. I'm using heat lamps because I've got heat lamps just to bake the lacquer. Most lacquers nowadays air dry anyway, so if you haven't got heat lamps, don't worry about it. But don't touch your work after you've painted it for, just leave it a day. Just leave it a day before you do any kind of sanding or any kind of finishing work on it after you've painted it. So while that's baking, I flipped back over to have a look at this bonnet and top of the bumper. I'm using an air DA. If you haven't got a DA or any kind of machine that can do that, then just do it by hand. Just after your 1500 grit, 2000 grit, ideally after 2000 grit, 3000 grit, and then polish up exactly the same as I'm doing here. So I really didn't know what was happening at this point, if it was going to turn out, if I'd messed it up, I didn't know. But the early signs were pretty good, so I kind of did a bit of a test patch, and then I had to go back to one of the other areas. I say we keep going back and forth because I was pushed for time and I've got to multitask to get it all done. So by this point, the heat lamps at 60 degrees had baked the lacquer that we've applied. If you're watching this, you've probably not got heat lamps or any means of drying the lacquer after you've applied it. My advice would be just leave it a day. Don't try and rush it. Most brands recommend 24 hours, particularly if it's out of a rattle can. Just leave it enough time. There's no point getting to this stage now and then ruining your job because you've got impatient and you've decided to rush it. You might be wondering as you're watching this, why has he got the sandpaper out again and why is he sanding back the job that he's just painted? Don't forget, we're painting outside. You do get little bits of dust, bits of shrapnel, even the odd fly if you're unlucky. And I like to make sure that my jobs look perfect, so I like to do the refining process at the end. And even in a booth, regardless of what people think, inside a booth, inside a body shop, you still get little bits landing your paint. So what I'm actually doing here is exactly the same as on the bonnet. I've just knocked it back with a little bit of 1500 paper, and then if you haven't got one of these little air DAs, that's absolutely fine. Obviously I'm pushed for time, I've got all the tools on the van, I may as well use them. You just follow it up with 2000 grit and then 3000 grit wet and dry by hand, and then you are ready for the polishing compounding stage. Any good coarse grit heavy compound will do for this job. Don't forget you're removing sanding scratches effectively, so it's not something that you're going to use a light polish on. It needs to be a compound and it needs to be appropriate for the job. Take your time, there's no rush. Getting this right makes all the difference to your job. Okay, so being a bit of a perfectionist, I wasn't happy with the headlights. Because of the weird shape and how these headlights sit within the bumper, I just couldn't quite get a decent buffing machine or any kind of contact within that narrow area that goes into the centre of the grille. It was really annoying me because I couldn't quite polish up the area and it just didn't look right. I wasn't happy with it. A little bit annoying really. It meant I had to go back, and then I also had to mask straight back on that fresh paint that I did the day before. So I'm applying some 2K clear coat to the surface. It's probably the best way of doing it anyway. You can definitely still do this with a rattle can. I've done videos on this and you just get a much better finish. Personally, it makes me feel better about it, so I was happy in the end. There you go guys, the customer was absolutely buzzing with his car because, like I said at the start, he kept it mint and these areas were letting it down. So we've covered headlight chip repair, bonnet chip repair and a bit of damage. We've sorted the bonnet out, touched that in and then polished it up. That came out really nice. So I definitely pushed myself on this job with regards to taking on some repairs what I'd not tried before. I'd never tried that method on the bonnet before. I definitely never sanded a headlight down with anything as coarse as 120 before. It turned out good. I was happy with the results. Whether I'd do it again, particularly on the headlights, not sure. It was a bit nerve-wracking in case something went wrong, but as you can see, they turned out. So hopefully you learn from my mistakes. I hope you liked this video. I hope you've been entertained, maybe learned something. If you could leave me a subscribe, hit the like button, drop me a comment below, let me know what you think, and thanks for watching.